My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Welcome to Mind Love, episode 244. Today's episode is all about how to work with anyone, even difficult people.
Even if the other person never actually reciprocates, and maybe you even decide, I can't work with this person anymore, and you leave or get transferred to another department or whatever you need to do, you can be proud of the fact that you behaved in a way that didn't meet them where they were at. Like you didn't retaliate, you didn't stoop to their level. You actually behaved in a way that was true and value-driven for you.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
If this is your first time giving your mind a little love, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Mind love is a habit, and the more you give your mind that love and intention, the better you'll feel about yourself and your life. Plus, it's really a win-win because more subscribers means Mind Love attracts even more amazing guests to bring you their wisdom. So don't forget to subscribe. Today, I'm really honored to share a review from Jawara Gordon, who says, "Such an amazing gift to the world. This podcast has become one of the most cherished parts of my week. As a parent and small business owner making a huge career change, I can relate to so many of the experiences that Melissa shares with her listeners. The passion she brings to the conversations with her guests is such a refreshing approach to this format. She's both candid and vulnerable about her personal life while adding insightful advice along the way. I'm so glad I found this positive light in such a chaotic world. The more I listen, the more I look forward to each episode." Thank you for this heartfelt review. These types of reviews just put a smile on my face for the whole week. It kind of brought a tear to my eye, and I'm just so thankful that you took the time. And now let's get to the show. Sometimes people suck. They're passive-aggressive, sometimes straight-up aggressive. They blame you for their wounds. They steal the credit for work you did. And that's all just in the workplace. It makes you wonder, though, are work relationships even worth it? Turns out they are. And we'll get into all the details why during the episode. But for now, just know that ignoring your colleagues because you have friends outside of work can do a lot of damage to your happiness and your career. And on the flip side, the stress alone of dealing with difficult people actually hinders our ability to work well. It dampens our creativity and productivity. It degrades our ability to think clearly and make sound decisions. And it eventually causes us to disengage completely. But I get it. Easier said than done. I legit quit a company while I was vice president because after 5 years, I just could not manage interacting with the CEO for one more day. There's something extra frustrating about work relationships, too. There are usually power dynamics, so you can feel stuck or silenced or scared. Or you're balancing your professional persona with the inner child who wants to kick Susan from accounting in the shin until she stops monster slurping her cup of noodles when you're trying to concentrate. Thank God for working from home. Now we can all just mute Susan. But even working from home, if you have that luxury or curse, depending on how you look at it, the same problems still come up. And sometimes even more so, because there's more room for miscommunication or unknown dependencies of your job, or less accountability, which can be frustrating for everyone involved. I've noticed that I read any email or text message in whatever tone matches the mood that I am in. It has little or nothing to do with the actual tone of the person who sent it to me. Who would have thought, right? But the thing is, we all do it. And by it, I mean that we all see the world through the lens of ourselves. We see people, experiences, opportunities through a lens that is uniquely us. So yes, Joe the CEO might actually be a dick, but there's also a chance that his behavior triggers you more than it triggers other people. Or yeah, Lisa in marketing might be passive-aggressive, but she could also just be shy or insecure or just have resting bitch face, you know? But what about those objectively difficult people? Or the people that clash with your personality? If work relationships are so beneficial to us, what can we do about them? How can we get along, or at least work with anyone, even difficult people? Well, that's what we're talking about today, and our guest is Amy Gallo. She's a workplace expert who writes and speaks about interpersonal dynamics, difficult conversations, feedback, and effective communication. And she helps people and teams better collaborate, communicate, and transform their culture to support dissent and debate. She's also the author of 2 books, Getting Along, How to Work with Anyone, and the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict. So 3 key things we will learn are what happens to our brains when we're in conflict, the archetypes of difficult people so you can better identify the root of their behavior, and 9 principles for getting along with anyone. Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777. And now let's welcome Amy Gallo to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So what inspired your recent focus on just getting along with people, especially in the workplace?
Oh gosh, it's been a focus of mine for a while in that a lot of the articles I've written, my last book was about conflict at work. So I've always been interested in how relationships or interactions can go wrong and what we can do to make them right. But I will say I started writing the book during lockdown, during the start of the pandemic. And I really saw how the pandemic really highlighted both what was great about our relationships with coworkers and what was challenging. And I feel like everything got intensified. So if you had a challenging relationship with someone, it got even more so. And if you got along with your coworkers, which I'm fortunate to do in my current role, we actually had stronger bonds. So I was really, really eager to help people who were struggling with those more difficult relationships to at least make them, if not positive, at least neutral.
Why do you think the pandemic did exacerbate whatever was going on or just kind of push people into their extremes? What do you think it was more so that everyone was just stressed out? Was it remote working?
I think it was a combination of all of that. A couple things. One, I think remote working, we all felt, well, I should speak for myself. I felt less human, seeing myself on the screen all day, not being able to look my colleagues in the eye, not being able to see their body language, like being this tiny, square on a screen. It just felt unhuman to me. And so and when you are not connected with your humanity, you're not going to use those emotional intelligence skills that are really important for getting along. Empathy, seeing someone else's perspective, social awareness, understanding the context. Like we were missing so much of that when we were working virtually. There's been a lot said about the cognitive load and the stress and, carrying a lot of emotional burden, whether that's because you are scared, the future is uncertain, or whether that's because you're caring for people all day long that you are used to sending off to school, whatever reason you have that stress, you're not going to be able to access your best self and really getting along with colleagues, or even people, whether that's family or friends. It helps when you're in a good place emotionally, physically. And many of us were not at that time and still aren't. I think that's fair to say.
For sure. I mean, I can relate whenever it's hard to compartmentalize in general. So when something's going on in one area of my life, it takes all of my will to keep it in that area, and I still do not succeed. It's like, like if I just get off the phone with somebody frustrating and then get another phone call, that person is going to hear the frustrated version of me. And so I'm curious though, with work relationships, I mean, we've talked a lot about relationship building on this show. But what are the benefits of having this skill with work in general? Because I feel like a lot of people would just assume, well, it's just work. I can just ignore them at work, or it might not be worth the trouble. Yeah.
And actually, I tell the story in the book. That was me. I mean, early in my career, I was like, it's just work. I'm not here to make friends. I have my friends. I don't need to get along with these people. I just need to focus and, be productive, get everything done, But all the time that I was thinking that, I was actually having relationships with people at work. Because for better or worse, it's where we form our identities, feed our egos, derive self-worth, right? We find community, we have a sense of belonging, and we do all that alongside our colleagues. So you're going to have relationships, whether or not you even think they're important. And what we know from tons of research, a lot of which I share in the book, is that the better those relationships are, the stronger they are, the better off we are. We tend to perform better, be more engaged, have more energy. There are even studies that show that the more likely you are to have the more likely you are to have friends at work, the better performance reviews you get. So there's just so much evidence that shows that it's important that we make these relationships as positive as possible. And yet, this is why I wrote the book, that's not always possible, right? People push our buttons. They show up with their own baggage. They make things difficult for us. But it is worth the trouble for sure to try to invest in having strong relationships, not just out of generosity to others, but also because it benefits you.
I had an experience right before I quit and started Mind Love. And a big reason for me quitting was it was just so hard to get along with a couple of people. It just felt like such a toxic environment. And I'm one of those people where I always look at my side of the street. But at that time, I was doing all the things. I was reading books, trying to figure out what to do. And I just could not manage to be my best self. I was like the worst version of me. And I think that's what made it so frustrating, is because I could look at specific instances and be like, okay, by the end of that, I was just as much in the wrong as the beginning. I just didn't initiate it. How do I step out of that? And why is it so hard when we're in conflict? What's happening to our brains that cause us to just kind of lose our ability to reason?
Yeah. I want to pause for a moment, because you're that story of being in a toxic work environment with lots of challenging people and choosing to leave and start your own company. I want to make clear, when I say it's worth the trouble to have positive relationships at work, I don't mean it's worth sacrificing your mental and physical health to do that, right? And I think that's a really important point, is that as much as I believe that having positive relationships or even neutral relationships is good for you, you don't have to go to excessive lengths to make that happen. And you shouldn't be sacrificing your own well-being to make that happen. So thanks for sharing that story and prompting me to make that point. But to your question, the brain science shows us when we have a difficult interaction with someone, it even can be as simple as a snarky email that comes into your inbox, we interpret that as a threat. And it might be a threat to our ego, to our resources, to our career, to our values, like the idea that we should get along with one another, right? That might be a value you have. And when our brain senses a threat, it's a protective machine. It will go into doing what it needs to do to keep us safe. And so that might mean going into amygdala hijack, with that what many people know as fight or flight. And so our brains, our heart rate goes up. We lose access to our prefrontal cortex. We simply just don't make great decisions. And then also, if you think about the fact that our brains are meaning-making machines, we start to tell ourselves a story about that interaction. So that snarky email, we might tell ourselves like, Amy always sends snarky emails. She's just incredibly passive aggressive. She's so rude. And we often tell ourselves stories in which we are the hero and the other person's the villain, or at least we're right and they're wrong. And so we get really cemented into these dynamics with someone that can be hard to get out of because, again, our brain is not cooperating. We actually need to, in many ways, work around our brain in order to find a point of connection with these people who are causing us to feel threatened and insecure, or just causing us to tell ourselves these stories about how we're right and they're wrong.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
I remember one of the first books that I read that really had to do with like mindfulness, which I have mixed feelings about the book now, but at the time it was like a great intro into a new way of thinking. And it was just the book everyone's heard of, The Secret, but she calls people personal emotional trainers. And that's just the one thing that still sticks with me from that, where sometimes I try to remind myself like, okay, yeah, this person seems super toxic, but maybe there's just something about our energies together where like, I need to learn something from this as well. So like I said earlier, I'm always looking at my side of it, but I know that's one of the first steps that you teach as well. But how do you really lay out doing that? Like what would be the process if you are dealing with a difficult person, you realize it's bringing out a bad side in you? What's that process for really laying out like where in there you could have done better or where you were triggered versus like just stepping out of it completely?
Yeah. Well, can I ask you, what does that mean, personal emotional trainer? What did the author of The Secret mean?
Yeah, she meant that people are put in our lives to teach us a specific lesson. And so like if you have an ongoing conflict with your mother, consider that maybe it's not an accident that you ended up with that mother. Maybe that's exactly what you are being called to master or to overcome to be the best version of yourself. And so it's just one of the ways where, because it's so easy to keep the blame on the other person and be like, yeah, but you're the asshole. You know what I mean?
That's right.
But then it's like, yeah, but okay, yes, that's true. And I have little to no control about that. But what if I just chose to look at this as a situation that's for me rather than happening to me? Like, what can I really get out of this and what would serve me the best?
Yeah. And I think, that especially your mother, you don't choose, but like relationships you choose, like a partner or friends and colleagues, we often don't choose. But those relationships you choose, that feels very true, is that we actually chose them for a reason because they're helping us work something out. And I think you have to notice the patterns. So I actually was talking to someone yesterday and giving advice from my book. And she admitted, she said, this isn't the first person I've had this dynamic with. And I was like, okay, let's talk about that. Because clearly there's something, it could just be bad luck, of course, but actually there's probably a role you're playing in creating this dynamic or recreating this dynamic. And let's look at that. To answer your question, like what are the steps? I think the very first thing is to watch your reactions, right? To be that fly on the wall to your own thoughts and actions in reaction to this person. So what's actually happening? What's the story you're telling yourself about this situation? And can you step back from that a little bit and really ask, like, see it as a story. Like, if you were going to even write down the few sentences you'd write about your dynamic with this person, what would those sentences be? And then I think you really want to do, once you have a little bit of space, and from that, hopefully observing those reactions gives you that. You then want to do what psychologists call reappraisal, right? Reassessing an emotional situation in a more positive or neutral light, or seen as a challenge instead of a threat. So instead of that person making you miserable, right? What are you learning from that situation? What opportunity does it present? And I don't want to imply that you need to be Pollyanna-ish and see the silver lining and everything. But part of the reappraisal is it helps you start to unpack the story you're telling yourself. Like, what thoughts are running through your mind? Are they helpful? Is there a way to reframe them? Is there a way to see that your know-it-all colleagues' diatribes, are actually, telling you something? Maybe there's some facts underneath them. One of my favorite questions to ask myself when I'm struggling with someone is, what if I'm wrong? Because I'm probably telling myself the story about it. And what if that story is wrong? What is another way of seeing this? And it doesn't necessarily mean they need to be right. But what if my assessment of this situation is actually off base? How would I behave differently? How would I see this differently? And, of course, you want to take care of yourself in these situations, because when you are depleted, as many of us were and are during the pandemic, right, you're not going to be able to see the situation clearly. You're likely going to bring in all the biases that we bring in, confirmation bias, affinity bias, right? You're going to bring all that into that dynamic, that interaction. So making sure you're well slept, you're eating well, are your other relationships intact? I mean, I can see oftentimes it goes both ways, where I'll have a really tough interaction with a colleague, and then I'll come home and I'm all of a sudden fighting with my teenager. I'm like, wait, why am I doing this isn't about her. This is about what this person said to me earlier today, and vice versa. If my husband and I are struggling about something, I'm not showing up as my best self at work with my colleagues. So trying to just remember that taking care of yourself is also a helpful way to observe and reflect on your part in this interaction.
Yeah, I love the advice on seeing something as a challenge instead of a threat, because it's such a simple mindset shift, but it's the difference between running away from it and going right toward it. And that doesn't mean to go towards it in conflict, but suddenly you can turn on a problem-solving brain or even a curiosity brain to get to the deeper issue. And it's funny how you mention something goes wrong at work, you might come home and get upset at your teenager. That was the trigger point for me of deciding to finally leave my last job. Was it was affecting so many of my other relationships. But it's funny when it's happening to us, when my boss would just blow up at me, we rarely stop and think, well, I wonder if something just happened before this. It's always about us. We want to make it about us. Oh my God, he hates me, or this, he's always like this. And so it's either just his fault or it's personal, when really it could be not any of those things. But it does help to ask, to even just inquire, whether or not you get the answers, what else could be going on, or what's the root cause of this person's behavior. Right.
Well, and there's actually a psychological concept called fundamental attribution error, which is that the easy example is you're late to a meeting and you think of all the reasons you're late, right? Your other meeting ran over, you have a back-to-back day, the Zoom call wouldn't load, whatever it is. And then if someone else is late, you're like, wow, they're disorganized or they're rude, right? And you attribute it to their personality as opposed to the circumstances. So what you're just talking about is actually trying to get out of that and thinking, okay, what are the circumstances that would cause someone to behave the way they are? What would lead someone to do this? And it doesn't have to be true, right? And I shared the story in my TED Talk, but my daughter, when she was younger, we were driving on the highway and these two motorcyclists came speeding past us so fast. They were probably going 90 miles an hour, maybe 100, and neither had helmets on. And I just was like, oh my gosh, that's so unsafe. I can't believe they do that. They could get really hurt. I was totally in the mom role of like, this is a teachable moment. And my daughter got into it too. Yeah, like, oh my gosh, I would never do that. I was like so self-satisfied. And then a few moments later, she goes, Mommy, maybe they were on their way to buy helmets. And that is absolutely not where they were headed, but it softened like our stance toward them. And I think, again, it doesn't matter if the interpretation is true. It just matters that you think about, well, what could be another explanation for this behavior? Because it makes you, to your point, more curious about their reactions as opposed to more certain that they're wrong or that they're awful or that they're an asshole.
And the truth is, it doesn't matter if the story's wrong because you're the only person that has to sit in those feelings. You know what I mean? And so
That's right.
If you can do anything to soften that, my husband and I do that all the time. Ever since we had our baby, the one thing that we go to whenever somebody gets cut off and there's like a moment of almost frustration, one of them will say to the other, like, oh, thank God we let that person in front of us because they're rushing to the hospital to have a baby right now. And that's just what I default to. And immediately it's like, oh, I hope they get there. Now I'm rooting for them.
That's right. Well, and just think about how simple that is. Like, because it doesn't matter. You're never going to see that person again. Now, unless they caused an accident, that's like a whole different story. And they could certainly cause an accident, but it's just that moment where you can choose to be super angry and so certain that what they did was wrong, or you can choose to root for them of like, I hope they make it, And the reality is, who hasn't cut someone off in traffic for whatever reason, right? Negligence or distraction, or because you were on your way to the hospital to have a baby. And that's one of the really important things that I really try to drive home in the book is that as much as these archetypes can be helpful in observing other people's behavior, it's also an important reminder that we've all done these things. Who hasn't been a know-it-all at some point? Who hasn't behaved passive-aggressively, right? You have to remember these are universal behaviors, and to just decide your coworker is not worth your time because they're exhibiting these behaviors just might be the choice that really locks you into the negativity as opposed to giving room for the dynamic to change.
I think it's important to recognize how you said these are universal conflicts that we have, and we tend to look at our individual conflicts as just so unique because it is. It might be like somebody messed up this one Excel spreadsheet about this certain company. Like, yes, that's unique, but
yeah,
the energy behind it, like the personality traits behind it, tend to fit all within categories. And I know you've laid out some archetypes that fit some of the most common ones. Which ones would you feel like are most often the instigators or the causes for conflict in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, so there's 8 of them in the book, and it's important that they're not, people understand they're not mutually exclusive. So you could fit into many of them, right? So your colleague could fit into 2 or 3 or all of them, or they could defy any of these categories, right? They might just have their own unique way of being a difficult person. But I do think that some of the ones that I see most often, are really most common, are like passive aggressiveness, the passive aggressive peer, also insecurity. The first archetype is the insecure boss. And those I see really come up quite often. The ones I see people really say, I can't deal with this anymore, I want to walk out, is often the tormentor, which is someone who you expect to be a mentor, but they actually make your life really miserable. That can be incredibly difficult to deal with. And I really have empathy for people who decide, I'm done, I'm not going to do this. And likewise, the biased coworker, the person who's just, exhibiting microaggression after microaggression, making the workplace really unpleasant and unsafe for people from underestimated groups.
Yeah, the tormentor is the one that I relate my last experience to. But it was so confusing because the biggest problem was that there was a whole relationship dynamic. He was like a guy in his 30s. I was in my 20s. He was still partying. So I'd go to his parties, but then have to be like in work mode when we got to work. And then he'd just like flip. And he was he'd just scream at people like anybody, probably because we were all doing party drugs at night, honestly. Like, looking back, the picture's so clear.
Right.
Maybe a little sleep, a little less Adderall, a little less cocaine, you would have been a decent human. But so he could have these moments of being like so generous and kind, and then these moments of being the exact opposite. And I was just like, oh my goodness. But like I said,
confusing.
It brought out so many of my worst qualities because it would just take me off guard. And so I wouldn't have the time to like, and I didn't have as many tools as I do now to like really ground myself and my energy before dealing with somebody else. But what I love about your book is that you lay out all of these principles for really getting along with anyone, and they work regardless of which archetype that you're dealing with. Right. But it does really help to know that archetype because there's some specifics for this kind of person, possibly where it comes from, and then possibly how to deal with those things. And I find that really helpful, especially for like the insecure boss, because there are little ways that you can like talk up somebody or like kind of ease their insecurities while being their teammate through these 9 principles. The first one that you talk about is focusing on what you can control. Now, when you're in a situation where you aren't the one in control of the company, you know, you're like the subordinate, how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, really what you can control is your reaction and your behavior. And, you know, you've mentioned a few times that you just weren't your best self, or you weren't proud of how you acted around this previous, colleague who was tormenting you. And I think that's another important step, is to really get in touch with your values and how do you want to behave, because that's something you can control. How you behave, is it aligned with your values? That you can't control another person. And trust me, I have sat across from someone and thought, if I could just like get into your brain and rewire you, this would all be fine, right? And I can imagine with your colleague, you're like, well, if you could just be the good version of you all the time, this would all be so easy. But you can't actually make someone do that. And so you really have to focus on your own reactions, your own behaviors, the role you're likely playing, even if it's a small role, in creating that dynamic or furthering that dynamic. And, when you don't have a lot of control, let's say you're further down in the hierarchy, or the person causing you trouble has a lot of power because they're your boss or higher up in the organization, the control I'm talking about is not get them in trouble kind of control, tell them to stop kind of control, because even that's not always effective, even if you do have authority over them. But it's more about really just controlling your reaction and your behavior.
So much easier said than done, but it's one of those skills that once you start to cultivate it, for me, it became almost like a game. It's fun for me now when I'm presented with a difficult person, because I think so often we try to control the other person or the situation in general. But instead, it's if I can just sort of surrender to the moment and be like, all right, well, I thought this moment was going to be about me sharing my ideas, but apparently this moment's about me breathing through stress. Then all of a sudden I at least have a goal, instead of just focusing on the fact that my other goal is being disrupted. It's like, well, maybe the universe had other plans.
That's right. Or like, what am I going to learn from this? Right? And that's one of the things, it's so hard to do, especially when someone is really making things unpleasant or toxic, right? It is hard to be like, well, good, I'm learning something. Like your brain is, of course, like, get out. This is horrible. Protect yourself. And sometimes that's what you have to do, like you did, right? Sometimes you do have to leave those situations. But my hope is that people will try some of the tactics that I share and see if that actually helps. And sometimes it won't. That's why there's also a chapter when all else fails, and talk in the last chapter a lot about how to protect your career and your well-being, because I'm not going to guarantee these tactics are always gonna work, but I think it's worth the time and effort to try them and to see if you can make some progress and to treat the whole thing. I mean, my my take on that of like, rather than the, like, what am I going to learn from this is like, which is similar, which is like, oh, this is an experiment, right? It's like, okay, can I actually find a way to get them to stop interrupting me throughout the meeting? If I try this, what happens? Oh, okay, they keep interrupting. Okay, let me try this. Okay, how does that work? And just to sort of refine my approach, the tactics I'm using all along, I mean, this is one of the other principles, is to experiment, because chances are the first thing you try may not work. And it may work. And then 2 weeks later, if something stressful happens, there's a reorg, or they get a new project on their plate that's really intense, and they revert back to the same behavior, like, oh no, I thought we fixed this. And so then you have to try again. And so treating it as an experiment that you're learning along the way, and you're trying different things to see what works, to me, that makes it much more palatable than, oh my gosh, how am I going to deal with this person every single day, which could be really overwhelming.
For sure. And I've also noticed when I make an effort, when I'm like using the tools that I've learned to communicate better with somebody, or to try to make somebody feel seen or heard or more confident, whatever it is, a lot of times over time, that becomes noticeable to the person. Even if they don't notice, oh, this person's really making an effort, they notice that they feel differently around you. And what I've found that's really great about that is a lot of times it models a behavior that plants a seed that you might not ever see the results of, but it might be like 5 years down the road that like you were some sort of inspiration for that person. And not guaranteed, but it's happened to me with a few different people where like at first I changed the way I was behaving and reacting. And at first I found that some people can be really triggered by that. Like they feel like you're being fake or something. They're used to specific interactions with you. And then you kind of hold firm in this new way of being. Maybe they'll take jabs at you at first, but then over time, there's been a couple different people in my life who have ended up coming to me while first being my least supporters, and then eventually being like, I just noticed a really big change in you. It's inspired me to do this. And then they're suddenly asking for help. And that's a lot to ask in like a work environment, but it's something that I think of because you never really know the seeds that you're planting, and your behavior is what does that over anything that you can say to a person.
Yeah. And I love that because you're also, even if you're modeling the behavior you want to see, it doesn't work, or you don't see the fruits of that labor because it happens long after you stop working with this person, you can at least be proud of the way you behaved. Like, to go back to the values conversation, if you start behaving the way you think is the right way, or the appropriate way, or the productive way, or the connected human way, empathetic way, then even if the other person never actually reciprocates, and maybe you even decide, I can't work with this person anymore, and you leave or get transferred to another department or whatever you need to do, you can be proud of the fact that you behaved in a way that didn't meet them where they were at. Like, you didn't retaliate, you didn't, stoop to their level, right? You actually behaved in a way that that was true and value driven for you.
One of the ways that we can ensure that we are proud of our own behavior is that self-reflection that we talked about earlier. But one of the principles that you teach is to be aware of your biases. And that is so hard because if you're biased, you tend to see things through a very specific lens and you don't really see the other side. How do you recommend that people really become clear on what their biases might be?
Well, one, actually, the question of am I biased is a great place to start. So actually acknowledging we are all biased. We all have bias. We all exhibit bias, right? That's a great starting point. But then there's also, there are tons of tools out there where you can actually understand a little bit more about your biases. There's quizzes online. There's actually one I really like from a project called Project Implicit, which is, they use research-based tools to help you understand that what your biases might be. The other thing is to think about what are the perspectives you're not usually exposed to, and where might you be making assumptions, or where might you have prejudices that you weren't aware of. And that, may involve listening to podcasts or reading articles or books written by people who aren't like you. Watching TV shows that represent a different perspective, exploring a different culture, by doing your own research or even like attending educational events. Those all help you see the ways in which you can get locked in your own lens. And I think especially when you're starting to see something with someone and you think with a difficult person and you start to assume something about them, like that is an inappropriate way, or they're being a know-it-all, or they're rude, whatever that sort of snap judgment you make. There's a trick I actually learned from a TEDx talk I once watched about implicit bias. It said they use an approach called flip it to test it. So ask yourself, if your colleague was a different gender or race or gender identity, would you make the same assumptions about them? Would you be willing to say the same things or treat them the same way? And, the other thing is, and I share a story in the book about how I was made to realize I was being biased toward a colleague who was a Black woman and presuming she was going to be angry if I challenged her, like falling into that awful, Black woman, angry Black woman trope. And it wasn't until someone else called it out. And I think that's the other thing, is telling the people around you, I'm trying to get better at seeing my biases and noticing when they creep into the way I behave or the way I speak. And I'd like you to point them out, because other people see our behavior often much more clearly than we see our own. So that feedback can be really helpful as well. I just wouldn't put that burden on someone who might be the object of the bias, but someone who shares your identity in some way.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I took this pretty intensive public speaking course, and they gave me a really powerful way to ask for feedback, or it's more of a directive when asking for feedback, because so often we will tell people like, hey, I'm just trying to get better. Can you call me out when you see something? Might not be the best way to do it, because then all of a sudden people are like, yeah, you're rude sometimes, and this and this and this. And then all of a sudden you're overwhelmed and resisting, versus saying something like, hey, I'm really working on this specific thing and noticing my biases. Can you like gently tell me if you see me falling into any of this? Because I really strive to be as unbiased as possible, just as if people are looking to ask for that feedback.
Yeah, no, I love that. And who hasn't had a boss who's like, do you have any feedback for me? And the question, you're like, I do have a lot of it
like
right
your
now,
pants are horrible.
But then like, am I really going to tell my boss? Like, but if they said, I'm working on, including more team members when I present to senior leadership, right? Do you think I'm doing that? That would be a much easier question to answer than like, hey, do you have any feedback for me? So yeah, I love that call out of just trying to ask for specific advice, and even saying, have you noticed one thing, right? Really making it very narrow so that it's easier for someone to do.
Another one of the principles that you talk about is not making it me against them. But that's so hard when you're in conflict. So how do you get to a place where you do realize, oh, technically we're supposed to be working toward the same goal?
Yeah. And it can feel, right, like a tug of war of like, and it's often a tug of war over like who's being appropriate, who's being inappropriate. I mean, that's one of my favorite questions. People will come to me and they'll say, oh, listen to this story of my coworker. And they'll tell me about this thing they did. And they're like, isn't that inappropriate? And I think, well, it was appropriate to someone because they did it, right? Like they clearly think that's appropriate. So, it can feel very much like you're on this tug of war. It's just you. Then there's two entities in this situation, you and the other person. What I like to do is really try to think of three entities and visualize this. Really try to visualize there's you, there's the other person, and then there's the problem that you're trying to solve. And the problem might be that you need to get the project plan done, right? Or it might be that you need to get this client work out the door. Or it might be the way you interact is the problem. But if you can see yourselves on the same side of the table, as opposed to on opposite sides of the table, which is a negotiation trick, right? Trying to make sure it feels like we're in this together. And that might be using words like we instead of I or you, just using small tricks to remind yourself and to signal to the other person that you're on the same team. And also trying to figure out, like, what do you actually have in common? And I don't mean like you went to the same school or, I don't mean that kind of stuff. I mean, what's your shared goal? But what do you both want? Is it this for the team to succeed? Is it that You're trying to execute on the mission of the organization. You both care about that. Trying to rely on that so it feels like you're not constantly at odds or at war, I think can really help with that getting out of that me against them mindset.
Yeah, and I found that even just engaging in one of these thought experiments, whether you're suddenly shifting the perspective to your own bias or you're kind of visualizing it in a different way, or you're focusing on the things you can control, it takes me out of tunnel vision. And tunnel vision is the place that always happens when I'm in like extreme conflict. I remember learning from an NLP professional one time that if you ever find yourself like in conflict with someone and you feel yourself just like shooting daggers, then to just spread your arms out to the side like you're on a cross, as morbid as that sounds, but then put your fingertips forward and wiggle them to where you can just barely see them out of your periphery. But the moment that you soften your gaze to the periphery, you get out of tunnel vision, and it does something in your brain where it makes it easier to kind of deal with that moment without just being like, like going straight towards this. Yeah, and it's really helpful. But even any of these tools kind of does a similar thing, just not physically. It's like suddenly you shift your focus out of that one like angry stream of energy that you're shooting forward, and you're thinking about something a different way or looking at it differently or focusing on yourself. And it's just a lot easier to get into that empathy side of your brain when you need to start seeing things differently, which is another principle.
Yeah. Well, and I think I love that idea. It's like you're just trying to see the periphery. I mean, that's both literal in the case of the exercise you just shared, but also metaphorical of what else is going on. And sometimes I think even just changing your focus of like, I'm putting this down for an hour. I'm a big fan of the go to sleep angry because I actually think going to sleep angry, you're going to wake up less angry. It's usually the case that you're not going to have the same intense feelings you had 12 hours ago or 8 hours ago, whatever, how long over, and I think that really trying to put your brain on something else that either causes you to be creative or rest, or like you'll just go back to that situation with a different perspective and a different attitude, which can be really helpful.
You also talk about knowing your goal. How does that really relate to conflict? Or are you talking about like the overall goal that the team is trying to solve?
No, I'm actually talking about your specific goal in that relationship. I mean, because I think, or in that conflict. So, in my last book, The HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, this was one of the critical steps before you ever even address conflict, is to think about what is it you actually want. Because oftentimes we get so focused on either proving that we're right or, making them reflect on their behavior, or, these goals that really aren't that helpful or even achievable. And instead, I think it's helpful to say, okay, what is it I actually want here? And it may be that I want to interact with this person less. That might be your goal, and that's fine, right? Or your goal may be, I actually want to get this project done so that we both look good to our bosses because we're both up for promotions. Or it might be that my goal is to, come to appear as a team player to the people around us. And this conflict is making it look like I'm someone who's hard to get along with. But whatever your goal is, let that then drive the tactics you choose, the approach you take, the values you live into. Because that, and having that as a focus really gets you out of it helps with that me versus them. Because instead of becoming a sort of polarized dynamic that you have to navigate, you then have something you can actually try to work toward. And it may be even something tiny, like I don't want to cringe when I see their email pop up, their name pop up in my inbox. That's a laudable goal. Fine, And I think you can have multiple goals, but really try to prioritize, like, what are the most important ones? I'm also a big fan of like stickies. I have stickies all over my desk, things that I want, either mantras that are important to me or things I'm trying to achieve. So if you're really struggling with a colleague and you figure out what your goal is, put it on a sticky so that next time you get on a Zoom call with them, or next time you have to get an email from them that triggers you, you look at that goal and say, okay, no, this is what I'm actually trying to achieve.
I love that broader version of it, because I think that's helpful in literally everything you do. Like, what is the goal? Who do you want to be? And to remind yourself as often as possible, because the more that you can align yourself in behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, that's when I feel like you really start to feel confident in who you are, because you're not like hoping to be this way, but acting this way, but thinking this way. And so it's really helpful. But also, even in just knowing your goal in those individual instances, I recently did an episode on how debate teaches us how to listen and be heard with this like professional debater. And his very first principle was know what you're arguing about, like know what the debate topic is. And so often when we get in an argument with somebody, we don't even realize how much our focus is changing. Like first it's about this, and then it's about that person's tone, and then it's this, and then and then you don't even realize what you're arguing about anymore. So you're never going to get anywhere. But if you can even just pause and say, wait, what? He would recommend to just say like, wait, what is the goal for this? Or like, what were we just talking about? Like, what are we arguing about? Any of those things. And then realizing like we're all talking about something different.
Yeah. I love that. Is that Good Arguments? Is that the name of the book?
Yeah.
Yes. It's funny. My daughter does debate, and she's a teenager. She's in high school. She's on the debate team. And I saw that book and I was like, I have to read this. But I actually bought it for her first. So she's away at camp and has it. So as soon as she's back, I'm going to read it, because I really... that's it. The book looked amazing. And what you're saying, it aligns so much, I think, with what I talk about in my book. I think he and I would have a lot to talk about.
Oh, you should definitely get that conversation going. If you want a gist of it, just go to mindlove.com/x93 and listen to the episode.
Awesome. I will do that.
So how bad is gossip in the workplace, though? Because I know how it feels when you're so frustrated with this one person. You feel like maybe you're crazy. You want to talk it out with somebody else, see if they're experiencing it. But is there any benefit to venting at all?
It's funny. My mind has changed on this a little bit, because actually in my first book, I talk a lot about how you should vent. You should definitely vent to people, get it out. And I caution, choose who you vent to wisely. Don't choose someone who's already involved in the dynamic, and choose someone who will help you see things from a different perspective. And I still believe that actually is helpful, but there's new research that shows that venting can actually help cement us in our positions. So especially if you go to the friend who's like, oh, you're so right. Yeah. So I actually feel a little bit differently now. And especially gossip. I mean, I think gossip, this principle, I say avoid gossip mostly, because I do think we know from lots of research about gossip in the workplace that it plays a critical role in terms of getting information, forming bonds, especially people who are outside the traditional power hierarchies. It could be a great way to get insider information that they wouldn't have a way to get otherwise. And let's agree, if you and I have trouble with the same person and we talk about it, it feels so good, right? It feels like it powers all of the neurons that are just like, oh, I'm not alone. That person is awful. And there is some benefit to that. The problem becomes that it, as I said earlier, it can lead to confirmation bias, which is that you believe this person is difficult. Other person confirms it, and then all you see in their behavior is that difficulty. And it doesn't allow space for the dynamic between you to change. So, I think really what I want people to do is gossip productively. So instead of, isn't Amy awful to work with? It's like, I'm struggling with Amy and I want that relationship to be better. What have you found works? Right. And trying to really try to lean on people who might have the same view as you do, to give you tips on actually how to change that dynamic. And, remember also the research shows gossip actually reflects most poorly on the gossiper, not the subject of the gossip. So you actually are running the risk of appearing as unprofessional, as, even being labeled a difficult person yourself by engaging in that. So, again, I think you mostly avoid it. Recognize it does have some benefits, especially if you put a productive spin on it.
I can relate to that. And that's what I was thinking when you were sharing. I read that research that you talked about, and I also, both things, the fact that sharing, venting does kind of seal us into what we currently believe. And I believe the research I read was on survivors of 9/11, and the ones that talked about it the most, depending on how they spoke about it, were like still were not doing quite as well mentally as those who moved on from it as much as possible. And so I think there's a difference in, like you talked about, doing the productive way. Like, are you trying to derive meaning from it, or are you telling the story of your victimhood over and over again? And not to say you weren't a victim in that moment, but do you still want to be one now, is kind of the choice that you have to make. But back in my toxic boss experience, I was in my 20s. I didn't really know better. It was crazy, clearly crazy to everyone. People would get frustrated and walk out. And so I'd have conversations with people. And I guess they weren't doing that a lot. It was a very small company. And I'm like, I don't understand how we're dealing with this, blah, 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 like gossiping in the wrong kind of way too. And what I didn't realize is how many people had the exact same complicated relationship with the boss, where they were like friends on the side and then this thing. And so, of course, everything I said got back to the person that I did not want to get back to. So it was just chaos the whole time. And that was one of my biggest lessons. Like, you think gossip feels good, but it's one of those very momentary feel goods. The moment after it happens, I am always thinking, man, if this gets back, or what is that person now thinking of me? So it's really.
And what if that person's gossiping about you? I think that's the other thing. It's like, it can feel great. And I agree. It's temporary, that feeling, because again, you might be violating your values. You might be telling, I've had a difficult coworker who, it turned out I was gossiping about her left and right. I just wanted the validation that she was being difficult. And it turned out she was doing the same. And the word chaos is exactly how I would describe that, because no one knew what to believe. It became this like, what did Amy say? What did this other person say? It was just a mess. And truthfully, we never resolved it. Like, it's still out there in the world, and I feel terrible about it.
I feel the same about my ex-boss. Honestly, I'm like, there's parts of that guy I liked, but then a lot of parts I didn't. But it causes a lot of time for me to, or it's created a lot of time for me to think back. And I've had a lot of space from that situation. And so now I really only look at my side, and I can very much see that person in empathy, the things that he has gone through in the past. And it comes back to really always staying curious, because you can be curious in that moment about like, well, what's driving this person's behavior? Or what are my biases? How am I reacting to this? And then afterward, like contemplating like, okay, how could I have done differently? Like, now that I have space from this. And so just that curiosity, which I know is one of your last principles, and the one that is just anything that comes back to curiosity, I find so helpful, because in so many situations, whether you're in conflict or you're like depressed about your life, if you just get curious, it might lead you somewhere else.
Yeah, that's right. Just asking yourself questions like, why do I feel this way? Why might they behave this way? What have I done in the past to actually navigate a similar situation, right? Like, just again, asking yourself questions and asking questions about the other person gets you out of those stories you're telling yourself, out of the like confirmation bias that you're right, they're wrong, and just gives you the mental space you need to try something different.
So what if all else fails? What if all of these amazing tools just don't seem to be making much of a difference, but we also can't necessarily step away and just start our own company for whatever reason, financial reasons or seniority reasons, whatever it is. How do we protect ourselves?
Well, a couple things. I think want to establish boundaries, and that might mean that you don't interact with that person as much, or it might mean that you only interact with them in person and not over the phone because they're always rude to you on the phone, or vice versa, right? You only email with them because whenever you're in person, they roll their eyes and are sarcastic. Finding ways like what actually encourages the best behavior out of them, and can you interact with them in that way? Or it might be that, the boundary is I am clear about what I need out of the conversation with them. I only ask for that one thing and then I get out. I have a set, list of excuses for getting out of the interaction and I'm done. Or, it may be that the boundary is that anytime after you interact with them, you go find someone you really enjoy working with and spend 5 minutes talking to them. Or you have a song you listen to that helps you like reset and get out of the negativity that was created in that interaction. There's a concept called job crafting, which is you actually proactively redesign your role to make it more meaningful and less draining. There's a lot of research on this as well. And you can, how can you actually shift your job? So rather than quit, which maybe not be an option, what can you shift about the way you work or who you work with that helps you minimize the amount of time you spend with this person or decreases the amount of reliance you have in them. Now that's obviously more difficult if this person is your boss, but hopefully there's some ways you can make some shifts. The other thing you want to do is like document what's happening. So if in the event that you actually need to escalate to someone, can you keep really close records of what they said and did, what are the behaviors they're exhibiting that are causing problems? What is the impact to the business results? And at the same time, keep track of what you're doing, not just in reaction to them, but the successes that you're having. Most of us don't actually keep a running list of the accomplishments we've made. And I think it can be really beneficial, both if something comes to the point where you need to actually prove that you've done the work and this other person doesn't deserve the credit, or you want to show that you've actually had success in that role, but also from a psychological perspective, if you're dealing with someone who's constantly putting you down or being negative, to actually list the things you've actually been able to accomplish, I think can really, really help.
So many of those things, again, allow you to kind of shift your focus. It's so easy when you have an ongoing conflict to just like, that is what you're stressed out about. You wake up, you're like, oh my God, I got to go deal with this person. You come home, you're like, I just dealt with this person all day. Now I need to unwind. And so to be able to start shifting the focus back to yourself, whether it's to just track your wins, to apply some of these other principles, being curious and knowing what your goal is, all of those, it helps you to see like this person's just a factor in this overall experience. They don't have to be the overall experience. And I'm reminded of when I did leave my job, it wasn't one of those things where I was just like, okay, I'm going to quit. I can't handle this anymore. Like there was so much fear there. I didn't have something else lined up. I had a lot of self-doubt. And so the way I handled it is I started to get really clear on an overall goal. That's when I had my business idea, but I started to like take goal setting courses. And so suddenly, there was this work stuff I had to deal with, but I was excited to like get off work and work on my own thing. Mind Love started as a side project. And then what I was able to do was actually think, what in my current role would really help drive the success of my dream career that I am sort of building on the side? And suddenly I realized I had the keys to all of these marketing platforms with hundreds of thousands of users that I could like test messaging on. And then it was like fun because I felt like I was doing just sort of experimental work to get ideas for my future business while still serving this company. And so it made those last few months of working there actually really fun because I felt like I had inside access to all of these things that I wouldn't have if I were just doing my own business on the side.
Oh, I love that. That's so smart. And I think I'm a co-host of a podcast called Women at Work. And we've done a couple episodes on side gigs and freelancing. And that's just, a lot of people have questions about how to make that transition. And the way you did is so smart because it neutralized the agony of having to stick in that toxic workplace because you're like, wow, I'm actually getting a lot from this. But you were also building your exit ramp into something that you really wanted to do. So smart.
Well, there's so many tools that we have now to deal with difficult people that we work with. So for listeners that want to learn more and dive into more specifics about the archetypes and all of that, where's the best place to find you, your work, and your book?
Yeah, my book can be found anywhere that people buy books. So online and bookstores, any of those places. If you want to get in touch with me, follow my work, I recommend going to my website, which is amyegallo.com. I have a monthly newsletter where I keep people up to date on my work, but also share tips around conflict, communication, relationships at work. And then also I have tons of articles on hbr.org, Harvard Business Review, that if you go there, hbr.org, and search my name, you can find my articles.
All the links for this episode will be at mindlove.com/244. Your challenge for this week is to pick that person that just gets under your skin. Whether it's an obvious feud you have going or it's a more subtle one and they just irk you and they might not even know it. We'll use some of the techniques that we learned in this episode to experiment a little bit. And don't get discouraged if it doesn't work right away, or even at all. Because remember, the work that you're doing is more about you than it is about the other person. Yes, the ideal outcome is to suddenly magically solve all of your workplace feud woes. However, that's not always realistic. These psychological tricks have a huge impact on people. I use them all the time, and sometimes I'm amazed at how well they work. But there are those instances where they don't. And instead of being like, well, why do I work on any of this at all? I have to remember that I am honing myself. My job is not to sit here and try to craft other people. This life is about crafting myself and ending up as somebody that I'm proud of and living each day with that goal in mind. So let me know how it goes. Reach out to me on Instagram at mindlovemelissa, or leave a comment right on the show notes page at mindlove.com/244. If you'd love to support Mind Love, the best way to do that is by joining Mind Love Premium at mindlove.com/premium. You get early release episodes, ad-free listening, and you get a whole backlog of over 50 exclusive episodes that are only for premium members. You can also support one of my amazing sponsors, and you can find them all at mindlove.com/sponsors. Or you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you do, not only will you be my virtual bestie and I'll love you more than all the other listeners because that's just how it works, but you just might hear your name on the show. And that's all for today. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.